speaking at this stage is tricky because a number of the other speakers have sort of touched on a lot of the key issues that I would have talked about myself. So what I want to try and do as best I can. Am I the only one here? So what I want to say in this presentation, in a way, is a bit tricky. I want to say that at a conference which is formed around TTIP, I want to say that TTIP isn't really the problem. I think TTIP is crucially important, but TTIP and associated treaties are the symptom. So I want to try and situate this discussion we're having about TTIP, about CETA, about TISA, about TPP, about these various mega trade and investment deals. I want to situate them in a longer historical context, and just by way of sort of explaining that, I should say that when I came to this subject 2-3 years ago, when I first started hearing about TTIP and started trying to think about how do we explain TTIP, and again, a lot of people here have mentioned neoliberalism, and rightly so. So neoliberalism is definitely sort of the dominant ideological model which masks government policy and so forth over the last 20 or 30 years. And in legal scholarship, there's a school of work on what's known as new constitutionalism. Stephen Gill and other people have inspired this line of work, which says that what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years with the rise of neoliberalism is a concomitant rise in institutions of new constitutionalism. So we see increased protection in the rights of corporations. We see an undermining of the sovereign authority of democratically elected parliaments. We see a shift towards institutions like ISDS and so forth. So that seemed like an appealing explanatory sort of lens, or an appealing way of thinking about this. But it didn't seem sufficient either, because I think what TTIP forces us to do is to bring back to the fore again that very tricky C word, which is capitalism. And the fundamental problem we have is how power, how authority, how rights, how resources and so forth are distributed, protected and divided up in a capitalist system. So I'm going to try and situate my discussion of TTIP in the context of the last 40 or 50 years of more or less ongoing capitalist crisis. Excuse me, just to go back to something Robert said in his talk, he mentioned the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, the GATT system, and how that was slightly less objectionable because it arose at a time when the social state was expanding, particularly in the United States and in Western Europe, and that's obviously true. I think though we have to understand this period of time, this expansion, the founding of the NHS, the expansion of the welfare state, as an aberration in the history of capitalism. So depending on when you want to start it, date the beginning of capitalism from its inception, has been a crisis-ridden system with privileges for the few at the expense of the vast majority. This is sort of inherent in the dynamics of capitalism. We have a brief period post-World War II with the reconstruction of Europe, with the expansion of US capitalism, the reconstruction of Japan, where there is capacity, and also we have the continued imperial domination of colonies which broke up over time. And for this brief period of time, it's possible for capital, for capitalists and the capitalist class to reach a compromise with working people, particularly the advanced capitalist world. But that period came to a close in the late 60s and early 70s, and from then on, capitalism as a system has been faced with a series of crises. First and foremost, they had a decline in the rates of profits, and this has alternated over time for the last 40 or 50 years, and it's also suffered from what's known as the capital absorption problem. So that basically capitalism is producing more profits than it could profitably reinvest again. So the problem we have for capitalists as a class is they can't realise profits in the ways in which they need to in order for capitalism as a system to operate. Now, capitalism, there's an interesting phrase, it's a bit of a clunky phrase, but there's an interesting phrase by a guy called István Nastaros, who describes capitalism as a system of social metabolic reproduction. It is a bit clunky, but it's useful. So effectively, we think of capitalism as like an ecosystem that sustains and reproduces itself. And over time, since the early 70s and onwards, capitalists actively, the capitalist class, different capitalist classes in different parts of the world, have sought to find fixes to this decline in profits and this capital absorption problem. And we see that in the shift from GATS to the WTO. We see that in the completion of the single European, single economic area in Europe. We see that in the expansion of these multilateral and bilateral trade and investment treaties. But the problem is the crisis keeps on coming back because capitalism as a system is inherently crisis-ridden. And the crisis has come back most acutely from 2007, 2008 with the burst in the credit bubble. So what we have now is we have an economic system which can no longer sort of produce profits at the rate necessary for it to continue. So David Harvey, some of you may be familiar with him, when he says, and I'm not sure where he gets the number from, but that capital has to grow at 3.9% compound rate year on year in order for capitalism to remain a viable system. But with the existing sort of global economic order we have, there aren't sufficient outlets for profitable investment and so forth for capitalism. So what we're seeing now is a process where capital isn't a thing as such, it's sort of a complex social relationship, but capital is looking for new outlets, new ways of making money. And the two main ways we can do that in the world today is by opening up hitherto non-market sectors to the logic of capitalism, and by pushing down workers' wages, sort of social benefits and so forth. These are the ways in which capital can realise more profits in the current conjuncture. So all of this is a long way of saying that in Britain now at the moment, and Keith mentioned earlier the Trade Union Act, we also see in France now the ongoing protests against the labour reforms there. We'll have one speaker from Greece and we have another and also coming from Ireland. We know that the downward pressure on workers' rights and on pensions and on benefits and so forth aren't caused by TTIP. TTIP isn't the problem in this context. Again, these are processes inherent in the crisis-ridden capitalist system. But where TTIP is important, I think, is that what TTIP and similar agreements seek to do is they seek to lock in and legitimise and normalise these downward pressures which the crisis of the capitalist system are imposing on governments and nations around the world. So one of the famous slogans on the rise of neoliberalism was Margaret Thatcher's "There is no alternative." This was the famous slogan she had. Well, TTIP and similar such agreements seek to lock in this dictatorship of no alternatives. TTIP is the equivalent of before when the Romans would defeat an army or defeat an enemy and they'd salt the earth afterwards so nothing could grow afterwards. Basically, the battles have been won in the political arena. The left, the historic left in Europe has been defeated. Trade unions have been on the back foot for the last 30 years. Someone mentioned, it was John mentioned the Social Democrats. Social democracy has proven itself to be bankrupt as a historical force. And now what these agreements seek to do at this moment of crisis is lock in the gains that have already been made by the capitalist class and make it impossible to reverse them. So this is where TTIP is important, not because TTIP is the cause of the NHS being privatised, because actually, sorry, I'm terrible with names. Karina mentioned earlier that one of the problems we have with TTIP vis-a-vis the NHS is that elements of the NHS already operate on a market basis. And these were reforms that were introduced tentatively by a Conservative government, but then even more so by a Labour government, and again by the current Conservative government. So this logic of marketisation, this logic of commodification is inherent in the system, and TTIP then seeks to lock that in. So this is where I think that, or why I think TTIP is important. To pick up on some of the key themes then that this panel was asked to speak to, citizenship, democracy and justice. On citizenship, there's an interesting book. There's an author called Max Barry. It's Max with two X's. I don't know why. I'm sure it seemed like a good idea. There's an author called Max Barry who wrote a book back in the early 2000s called Jennifer Government. And in this book, he imagines a dystopian, distant future where countries aren't nation states as we know them, but people live in corporations, as it were. So I wouldn't be a republic. I would be from the Principality of Coca-Cola, for example. Somebody else may be from the Ford Motor Factory, whatever the case may be. And this again is interestingly what we're seeing in this current era. Again, it's a sort of literary exaggeration of it, but this is exactly what we're seeing, because neoliberalism wasn't just about, neoliberalism wasn't just about a particular set of policy prescriptions, deregulate, privatise, roll back the state. It was never really about that. That was always the sort of utopian rhetoric of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was first and foremost a very concerted and heretofore a very successful political assault on the working classes, particularly it started in the South and has rebounded again. You could say it started in New York. There are different sort of possible starting points. But neoliberalism is first and foremost a political project, and it's a political project which has succeeded, and a political project which, in the form of these massive agreements, is locking in its successes. And part of that is strengthening the citizenship rights of corporations, because of course, legally speaking, corporations are people. And the legal form of the corporation is a crucially important one to capitalism, because the very raison d'etre of the corporation is to maximise profits to the exclusion of all else. And the legal form of the limited liability corporation allows capitalists massive entitlements, massive rights, massive protections with very limited responsibilities, because you can file for bankruptcy and so forth. So this is what's happening in terms of citizenship, that agreements such as TTIP completely rebalance it, completely shift the focus, enhancing the citizenship rights, enhancing the power and influence of corporations and the capitalist classes that deploy them at the expense of the average citizen. It's been mentioned that sorry, I'll get through this very quickly. It's mentioned that we had a petition signed by 3 million people across Europe against TTIP, and that's really important, but it's still less than 1% of the population of Europe who signed this petition. So in terms of having an active civic citizenship that responds to assault by corporations, we need to be sort of thinking about ways of doing a lot more in that context. In terms of democracy, it's important to remember that capitalism is only democratic very grudgingly. So some of you may be familiar with the work of C.B. Macpherson, who's a Canadian political theorist, who made the point that liberalism was liberal long before it was democratic, and so liberal democracy was a very late arrival on the scene. And neoliberalism, as we've come to see, is a retreat back to that pre-democratic form of liberalism. So Peter Mayer has written this book called The Covering the Void, which shows that over the last 30 years we see citizens and ordinary individuals engaging less with democratic processes. We see political elites who have captured these democratic processes and structures withdrawing from the people. And again, the ways in which TTIP has been negotiated, it's difficult when you try and have this discussion with people who perhaps might not have the benefit of reading the sort of the literature on political science and economics and so forth, and you say, oh yeah, they had a room where you had to get special permission to go in and see the documents, and you couldn't make copies of it, and you go, oh, Illuminati. You go, no, it's not that. It's the logic of the capitalist system, which is inherently undemocratic and excludes the interests and excludes the concerns of the vast majority and privileges the interests of a small number of people. And again, when John mentioned the form and the manner in which this agreement has been negotiated, it's the logical outgrowth of this, because you can't be honest with people if you're going to be robbing them. You can't tell people I'm going to rob you. You have to say, we're going to create millions of jobs, and you say, oh, well, look at NAFTA, which led to a net loss of 1 million jobs in the US, and you promised them jobs, and you go, oh, well, that was NAFTA, this will be different. So you can't do that openly, so this, hence the secrecy and hence the lack of transparency. And just finally, in terms of justice, yeah, absolutely, ISDS, and again, I don't even think ISDS is the worst aspect of it. I think it's one that has caught people's imaginations, and rightly so, because we have seen in Egypt, in Germany, in Sweden, in Uruguay, we have seen corporations successfully either intimidate or win victories against governments using the ISDS mechanisms, and that's important. But crucially, what's more important is that, and Keith touched on this, and also Karina touched on this, what's more important is that agreements such as TTIP, what they do is they facilitate and enhance and accelerate this logic of commodification, of commercialization. They further unburden sort of capital in that sense. And that necessarily produces injustice in myriad forms. Gender was mentioned earlier, and it will always be the case under capitalism that working class people suffer most, working class women suffer more than them, and working class people of colour and working class women of colour suffer more than them. So the injustices experienced by people will always be gendered and racialised, but this is a system which produces injustice as a natural consequence of how it operates, and TTIP just serves to further lock that in. So I'll leave at that. Yeah.